Hello, ladies and gentlemen, to my commentary. Brussels had weathered many storms before, but nothing like the one now tightening around Europe's political core. Inside closed meeting rooms, curtains drawn, phones collected, advisors whispering to ministers who no longer look certain of anything. A single question was being debated with attention so sharp it almost felt audible. Should Europe finally cross the line and use Russia's frozen sovereign assets? What began 2 years earlier as a temporary precautionary freeze, a symbolic gesture meant to punish Moscow economically without escalating into open confrontation, had slowly mutated into a structural trap. It was never supposed to reach this point. Western leaders imagined the immobilization of Russia's reserves would last months, not years. Yet here they were, staring at spreadsheets outlining Ukraine's looming fiscal collapse in early 2026, and realizing the political reality they had hoped to avoid was now impossible to escape. Ukraine's state budget was bleeding faster than foreign aid could fill it. European publics were exhausted, disillusioned, and increasingly skeptical of endless commitments. Washington, reshaped by the return of a Trump presidency, had introduced a new layer of strategic uncertainty, leaving Europe unsure whether the United States remained a reliable partner or a volatile force acting entirely on its own timeline. Against this backdrop, the once untouchable idea of using Russia's $300 billion in frozen assets had not only resurfaced, but was now rapidly gaining momentum. Some EU leaders, driven by desperation and political fear, framed the assets as a morally justified resource, a way to help Ukraine without imposing painful fiscal burdens at home. Others warned that touching central bank reserves would be an earthquake in the global financial system, a precedent so dangerous that even discussing it risked undermining Europe's credibility as a safe custodian of global wealth. Belgium, which hosts the vast majority of the reserves through Euroclar, was the most outspoken voice of caution, insisting that the legal and geopolitical fallout could be catastrophic. Yet within the European Council, its warnings were increasingly drowned out by a rising sense of necessity, even inevitability. The transformation happened quietly at first. So quietly, in fact, that many European officials did not even notice when the language in internal documents began to shift. What had been described for 2 years as Russian reserves immobilized was now tentatively and almost timidly being referred to as a potential financial instrument. The distinction seemed harmless, a matter of semantics, yet in truth, it signaled something far more consequential. Europe had begun searching for a way to use Russia's money without admitting that it was about to cross a line once considered sacred. Inside Brussels, the pressure was crushing. Months of debates had hardened into something more like desperation. Ukraine's finances were deteriorating with mathematical precision. Each projection showed the same dreadful conclusion. Kiev would face a liquidity crisis by early 2026, and Europe simply did not have the political unity nor the fiscal appetite to fill the gap alone. For the first time, the prospect of Ukraine running out of funds was not an abstract concern, but a real looming threat that could destabilize the entire continent. It was in this atmosphere of mounting anxiety that the idea of a reparations backed loan emerged. The proposal was seductively simple on the surface. Europe would not confiscate Russia's $300 billion outright, but would instead take the interest generated by those assets or use them as collateral to finance Ukraine's survival. European lawyers insisted that this was not theft, not confiscation, not even appropriation. It was merely a temporary measure, a clever workaround, a way to transfer value without touching the principle. But underneath the polished legal language, the truth was unmistakable. This was a political maneuver designed to achieve exactly what outright seizure would accomplish, only with a thicker coat of legal camouflage. Everyone involved understood this, even those who claimed otherwise. Europe was stepping onto a slope it had sworn it would never descend. And each step carried the continent deeper into a realm where its own financial principles became increasingly malleable, increasingly negotiable, increasingly fragile. Belgium, home to Euroclar, the institution holding most of the frozen Russian assets, remained defiant. Its officials warned that such a loan would be struck down in court, that it would expose Brussels to billions in liability, that Russia would retaliate against Western companies still operating on Russian soil. Their arguments were sharp, grounded, and deeply rooted in the reality of international law. But in the increasingly charged atmosphere of Brussels, caution sounded like obstruction and legality sounded like cowardice. Meanwhile, other European states, though outwardly supporting the loan idea, were quietly terrified. They knew that sovereign reserves were the backbone of global financial trust. If Europe blurred the boundary between freezing and using other nations, China, Saudi Arabia, India, the Gulf monarchies would interpret it as proof that Western custodians could no longer guarantee neutrality. But saying this aloud risked political backlash at home, where leaders feared appearing weak or unwilling to stand with Ukraine. The moment whispers reached Moscow that Europe was no longer merely freezing, Russia's sovereign reserves, but actively constructing financial mechanisms to use them, a profound shift took place inside the Kremlin. The conversation in Brussels about reparations backed loans and temporary utilization was treated in Western capitals as a legal nuance, a clever workaround meant to retain plausible deniability. In Moscow, however, this semantic dance was interpreted as something far more serious, an existential breach, a declaration that the West had abandoned the last remaining rules of post Cold War financial conduct. For Russia's leadership, the difference between immobilization and utilization was not academic, not procedural, not subject to reinterpretation. It was categorical, it was absolute, and it was unforgivable. The reserves did not belong to private companies or banks. They belonged to the Russian state itself. Any attempt to extract economic value from them, whether through interest, collateralization, or indirect loans, was perceived not as a financial adjustment, but as a hostile seizure of sovereign property. And once the West crossed that threshold, Moscow concluded it had signaled the end of neutrality, predictability, and the global financial order as Russia had known it. Yet the Kremlin did not respond with panic. Instead, it responded with calculation, strategic, patient, and devastatingly precise. Western politicians rarely acknowledged it publicly, but Russia held an enormous advantage that almost no one in Europe dared to speak about openly. Western corporations still possess nearly $1 trillion in assets inside the Russian Federation, accumulated over decades of investment in energy infrastructure, manufacturing, retail, finance, and industrial supply chains. Germany, France, the Netherlands, the United States, Finland, each had companies with deep stakes in Russian markets, factories, pipelines, real estate, and logistical networks. In the early months of the Ukraine conflict, Moscow had tested small scale retaliatory measures. It imposed forced discounts on Western firms attempting to exit. It temporarily nationalized subsidiaries belonging to unfriendly states. It implemented capital controls that restricted the repatriation of profits. These steps were warnings, not weapon signals that Russia could escalate. If provoked, Europe largely dismissed them, assuming Moscow would not risk a full economic confrontation. But now, with the Brussels inching closer to monetizing the frozen reserves, the Kremlin began preparing something entirely different: systemic retaliation, the kind that rewrites the economic relationship between Russia and the West for a generation. Drafts of new legislation circulated in Moscow's ministries proposing sweeping powers. Full nationalization of Western owned assets deemed critical or strategically relevant, forced transfers of minority stakes to Russian or BRICS aligned investors. Windfall taxes that would render Western operations unprofitable overnight. Permanent restrictions on profit outflows, effectively trapping Western capital indefinitely. Reallocation of seized assets to Russian state enterprises or partners in China, India, and the Gulf. The logic behind this escalation was brutally simple. If Europe weaponized Russia's reserves, Russia would weaponize Europe's corporate presence. Moscow's strategists also understood the broader geopolitical stakes. Retaliation would not merely punish Europe, it would demonstrate to the rest of the world that Western jurisdictions were no longer safe custodians of foreign wealth. It would show emerging powers that alternatives to Western financial systems were not only necessary but urgently justified. Europe believed it could touch Russia's assets without consequence, but Moscow was preparing a counterstrike not measured in billions, or even in political theater, but in the destruction of a financial relationship that had taken 30 years to build, leaving the West to reckon with a retaliation it never fully imagined, yet now could no longer avoid. When news leaked that European policymakers were seriously considering the utilization of Russia's frozen reserves, no matter how carefully disguised under layers of legal engineering, the global financial system reacted with a mixture of disbelief, dread, and cold strategic clarity. The consequences long warned about by cautious economists and legal scholars were no longer theoretical models or academic warnings. They were rapidly becoming the lived reality of an international system that had been held together for nearly 8 decades by a single unwavering principle. Sovereign reserves are untouchable regardless of conflict or political enmity. The first tremors rippled through the halls of Euroclar, the world's largest settlement house, and the institution that happened to be holding the majority of Russia's immobilized funds. Euroclar's entire existence depended on trust, the belief that its custodian role was neutral, predictable, and insulated from political storms. But now, the very foundation of that trust was being shaken. The mere suggestion that sovereign assets could be repurposed for wartime financing carried an implication so enormous that markets struggled to price its implications. If Russia's reserves were vulnerable, whose reserves were truly safe in capitals across Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America, that question was asked with increasing urgency. Beijing convened closed-door meetings with its central bank officials. Riyadh requested emergency assessments from its financial advisors. India, the UAE, Qatar, even Turkey quietly began evaluating their exposure to Western custodians. These were not symbolic gestures. They were the first signs of a deep structural shift, a recalibration of global reserve strategy that could take years to fully unfold, but would be irreversible once it began. The fragility extended far beyond institutional custodianship. The euro itself, the crown jewel of European monetary power, found its credibility rattled. Its strength had always rested not just on economic size, but on the perception of legal neutrality, the belief that the eurozone's rules were predictable, fair, and beyond the reach of political opportunism. But by blurring the line between freezing and using sovereign reserves, Europe risked transforming its currency into something more volatile, more politically conditional, and ultimately more fragile. Global investors began reevaluating euro denominated holdings. Discussions once unthinkable emerged in financial circles. Would European bonds require a new risk premium? Would foreign central banks begin a gradual but significant diversification away from the euro? Would the continent's long term borrowing costs rise as the world adjusted to a Europe that no longer played by its own rules? Meanwhile, in the geopolitical shadows, BRICS nations sensed an opportunity that had been years in the making. They accelerated work on alternative financial systems, commodity linked payment mechanisms, new settlement infrastructures, and parallel banking networks designed explicitly to reduce dependency on the dollar and the euro. What had been a slow, cautious evolution now gained the momentum of a geopolitical tidal wave. And yet, the greatest danger was not the immediate market reaction or the quiet rebalancing of reserves. It was the loss of something far more abstract and yet infinitely more powerful. The perception of Western neutrality, once sovereign reserves became tools of geopolitical coercion, the moral claim that Western financial systems served as global public goods began to crumble. Europe's Decision, whether deliberate, reluctant, or merely desperate, has triggered a chain reaction that reaches far beyond Moscow, Kiev, or Brussels. It has placed the entire post-Cold War financial order at risk, setting the stage for a world divided not only by geopolitics, but also by competing monetary systems, each with its own rules, loyalties, and vision of the future. In the end, Europe did not leap across the red line. It drifted over it inch by inch, carried by the slow gravitational pull of necessity. After months of legal battles, political infighting, and a rising sense of historical urgency, Brussels settled on what it called a measured compromise. Instead of directly confiscating Russia's $300 billion in frozen reserves, Europe would seize something subtler, something that sounded less explosive to the public ear: the interest generated by those immobilized funds to European leaders. This solution felt elegant, almost reassuring, an arrangement that allowed them to maintain the appearance of legal restraint while still demonstrating to Kyiv, Washington, and their own domestic audiences that Europe had not abandoned Ukraine. They framed it as a temporary reversible mechanism, a middle path that avoided the diplomatic violence of outright expropriation. The principle they insisted would remain untouched. Europe could still claim it had not crossed the Rubicon, but Moscow saw no such nuance, no such diplomacy, no such restraint. In the Kremlin's view, extracting interest from sovereign reserves was merely confiscation by another name, a violation of property, principle, and precedent. The economic value belonged to the Russian state. Stripping it away, even indirectly, was indistinguishable from seizing the principle itself. There was no difference in meaning, only in marketing. And so Russia retaliated, not impulsively, not emotionally, but with cold, methodical calculation. New regulatory frameworks appeared overnight. Western corporations found themselves facing punitive taxes, restricted capital flows, and sudden legal interventions. Factories that had operated in Russia for decades awoke to the reality that they no longer controlled their own assets. Shares were diluted, boards were replaced, ownership structures unraveled. Moscow did not shout its anger, it enacted it. Meanwhile, the global financial system felt the tremors. Europe's compromise had not prevented the world from questioning Western neutrality. If anything, it had deepened those doubts. Central banks from Beijing to Riyadh began quietly adjusting reserve portfolios. Analysts tracking global capital flows observed patterns suggesting that something profound was shifting beneath the surface. Trust was leaking from the system, slowly but steadily. Inside Brussels, the truth became unavoidable. By attempting to balance moral duty with systemic caution, Europe had created a policy that pleased neither side and unnerved the world. It had demonstrated support for Ukraine, yes, but at the cost of very financial stability that made Europe influential to begin with. Therefore, the ending is not marked by victory or clarity, but by a heavy, ominous sense of foreboding. The post-Cold War order has been shaken, perhaps irreversibly, and Europe now stands at the edge of a new era, one in which the rules it once wrote no longer protect it, and the world it helped build no longer moves on the assumptions that once made it strong. Thank you for watching.